Deyanira Nevarez Martinez, who is one of our IRP emerging scholars. So she is an urban planner at Michigan State University. Got her PhD at UC Irvine in urban planning and blah, blah, blah.
Urban and environmental planning and policy.
Thank you. It was a long title. She's doing some really exciting and important work on homelessness among migrant farm workers and overlaps a lot with Latinx population. So we're thrilled to have her here, and I'll hand it over. So would you like to take questions as you go? So we often do clarifying questions as you go, but hold substantive to the end.
That would be fine.
So we'll do it that way. And she has a lovely voice, but please raise your hand to tell her she needs to be louder.
Yes, please.
Yes,
thank you so much. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. I know, you all are Midwesterners, so maybe it's not super cold for y'all, but I've only been in the Midwest for a year, and it's an experience, and today is a little cold, so thank you for being here. Like Catherine said, my name is Deyanira Nevarez Martinez. You can call me Deya. And I am an assistant professor of urban and regional planning at Michigan State University. I'm also a core faculty member in Chicano Latino Studies. And I am a 2021-2023 Emerging Poverty Scholar with IRP, which has been a really great experience. Thank you all so much for providing that opportunity for me. It's been really great to get my career off and running, and so thank you. And I want to thank IRP for inviting me. I also want to thank Dr. Catherine Magnuson for making all of this possible, and also Rebecca, and also where is Dana? I don't know if she's here. Dana Connolly. She's been really great in getting me to turn in all of the forms I need to turn in for everything. So really, really great. So I also want to thank all of you for coming today. I see some really good friends in the crowd. I also see new folks, and I'm really honored that you would spend some time with me today learning about my work. I'll tell you a little bit about myself before I get started, just to give you a frame of reference of where I'm coming from and what I do and why I do. What I do, I consider myself a housing justice scholar. My research focuses on the role of the state in informal housing in the United States. And with that, I've looked at a different range of types of informal housing. So when I started my research career as a grad student, I worked in the colonias of the US-Mexico border. I am the daughter of farm workers, so I grew up between a colonia in southern Arizona and a migrant camp in the Central Valley of California. And so a lot of my work is informed by my life experience. And so I've also now doing work on the informal occupation of public space, also called homelessness. And so that's what I'll be speaking about today. Today I will talk to you about Latinx homelessness and the many nuances that exist when you're looking at that particular issue. There you go. So the title of this talk is The Latinx Paradox and Homelessness, the Invisible Housing Precarity of Latinx and Farm-Working Families in the Midwest. But in order to tell that story, we need to kind of backtrack a little bit, and I need to give you, talk to you about several things first. So we'll touch upon Latinx homelessness and the Latinx paradox and how it's been rendered invisible. And then we'll dive into what Latinx homelessness actually is and what it looks like, and in general, and in the Midwest specifically. And finally, what it all means for planning, public policy, and service delivery. So first, we're going to take what might seem, I think, like a little bit of a detour, because I need to set the stage about how and why there needs to be a bit of reframing when we're talking about Latinx housing precarity and homelessness. In recent years, I'm sure you have undoubtedly seen headlines like this. During this unprecedented housing affordability crisis, there has been much talk about multi-generational households. You spoke to Hope Harvey recently on the podcast, and so I'm sure you've been thinking about this issue. And so, especially families of color, right? So, especially Latinx families, and thinking about their multi-generational housing arrangements. And so here you see a few examples of what you might have seen. But I really want to complicate this for you. The Pew Research Center uses the annual social and economic supplement of the Census Bureau's population survey definition of multi-generational housing. And they define these households as those that include 2 or more adult generations, mainly people who are 25 years and older. A second definition is what they call a skip generation. So these households, these multi-generational households, consist of grandparents and their grandchildren, usually grandchildren under 25 years old. And to be sure, I myself am a Latina, I'm a Chicana. Multi-generational housing is something that we do. I myself, many times during my life, had grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins who would intermittently live with us. It's a very beautiful and normalized practice. And I want to honor that, and I want to talk a little bit about it so that you know where I'm really coming from with this. So, according again to the Pew Research Center, multi-generational housing is common among families of color. 24% of Asian families live in multi-generational housing. 26% of Black families live in multi-generational housing. Remember, those are those 2 types of housing, 2 adult generations, or grandparents and grandchildren. 26% of Latinx families live in these types of arrangements, and while only 13% of white families live in these types of arrangements. As you can see, it's not, Latinx families don't necessarily do it more than other families of color. It's pretty standardized across the board. There is, if you're a foreign-born American, usually you have higher numbers of that, and that's across racial lines. So everybody usually does it at that rate of 26%, and US-born Americans do it less at 17%. But to return to these headlines, it's true, this is happening. This is something that happens for many reasons. These include traditions and culture for sure, but it's also increasing because of the housing affordability crisis. And when we don't emphasize this, the narrative gets obscured and some really important issues get missed. So when we don't and we don't have to go very far to look at what I'm really alluding to here, which is this. So during the pandemic, we saw a glimpse of some of the problems that I really want to highlight, right? So COVID exposed the problem with this particular housing strategy that we sometimes continuously and erroneously continue to conflate with multi-generational housing. So to explain a little bit, in my work, I want to highlight an issue that has been rendered invisible in this conflation, which is extreme overcrowding. And so making this conflation worse are narratives that have been called, and many of you here have probably heard the term, the Hispanic Paradox. And to be more inclusive, I will be saying Latinx Paradox, even though in the literature it's mostly called the Hispanic Paradox. For decades, academics have made the case that Latinx communities are not as affected by their economic marginalization as they should be. They call it the Latinx paradox. It's been prominent in studies of public health, in education, in homelessness, and it really has had an effect on the ways that we view the Latinx community and their survival strategies. And I want to be really clear because we rightly see the community as resilient. Another term that can be very problematic, but they are resilient. We are resilient people. But scholars like myself suggest that these narratives obscure the reality and they shift the discourse to place the burden of survival and recovery on individuals to reshape the role of the state from a responsible party and provider of goods and services to a promoter of self-reliance, and has had a really detrimental effect on public policy, social services aimed at helping this population, and with their housing needs specifically in this case. So when we, comment on how great it is that Latinx communities aren't unhoused because we take everyone in, that's great, we do that, but then we end up in really impossible situations. And we really should hold the state responsible for providing services and alleviate some of that for folks. So the Latinx paradox originated as an epidemiological finding from studies that initially were conducted in the 1980s, the late 1980s to be specific. These studies initially focused on issues of life expectancy, but then they were expanded to things like teenage pregnancy, asthma, other types of respiratory diseases, and eventually in 1996 to the issue of homelessness, when Baker published her study. And so all of these studies appear to show that Latinx communities tend to have health outcomes that are paradoxically comparable to, or in some cases better, than those of US non-Hispanic white counterparts. And even though Latinos have paradoxically, because Latinos have lower income, average income, lower education, and socioeconomic status. And so, as it pertains to homelessness, researchers have noted that Latinx folks and African American folks share similar risk factors, including higher poverty rates and lower income and educational attainment. So, why does this contradiction exist, right? So in 1996, Baker classified this as part of the Latino paradox or Latinx paradox. She suggested that the most possible explanation of the paradox was an interaction of culture and institutions, that networks and multi-generational housing was keeping people out of shelters. And this wasn't then and still isn't untrue. This does happen, right? But I want to kind of detangle some of these things a little bit for you. This is happening. But this is where, so we'll transition a little bit into the second part of this presentation. We need to stop calling this phenomenon multi-generational housing, because this is not multi-generational housing. This is extreme overcrowding. And extreme overcrowding is not multi-generational housing. In fact, my co-authors and I call it doubled up homelessness. And it's a really difficult thing to quantify, because our methodology to account for unhoused people is not set up to really account for this. If we look at these headlines, we see some examples of what we're seeing in Latinx communities. We see, for example, that surveyors found about 40 people, farm workers, lodged into a 3-bedroom home with 2 bathrooms. That 20 farm workers were living in a house, and that a family of 8 is living in a 1-bedroom apartment. So in some of these more extreme cases, what people do is that they'll sleep in shifts. So half of the folks work day jobs, half of the folks work night jobs. And so while one group is sleeping, one is working, and then they'll trade places. The people that really, I mean, everyone suffers in this arrangement, but the folks that really suffer are the children, who never really get to, so they'll have physical ailments like urinary tract infections, for example, because they can't use the restroom, because there's always someone getting ready for work. And you're the really bottom of the food chain in that situation. And so these are the types of conditions that we see when we're looking at housing in this community. And this is happening in both rural and urban communities. This is happening in the Central Valley and in LA. This is happening in Wisconsin rural agricultural communities and in Detroit, in Chicago. Oh, yeah.
I was just wondering, is this a recent phenomenon, or historically has this been common?
So historically, this has been common-ish. I think at this point, it's in an extreme, like, because of the pandemic, because of the housing crisis, it's in extreme case. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's getting worse. Yeah?
Correlate that with the rise of factory farming in the Midwest, particularly. I mean, farming in the Central Valley of California is not different than.
Right. Yeah. So I think that it's interacting in similar ways in both places. Obviously more extreme in places like California, but not super dissimilar in places like the Midwest. Any other questions? No. So, where am I? Here we are. So what is this if it's not multi-generational housing? I think you all know where I'm going with this. We think it's homelessness. People are they are inside of a structure, but they aren't stably housed. And so doubled-up homelessness is distinguished from broader household sharing by how permanent, voluntary, and adequate the doubled-up arrangement is, and whether a person would be on the street or in a shelter if it were not for their informal shelter provider. And people really end up in these situations for two reasons. So doubling up of this nature is documented as both a precursor to street and sheltered homelessness and a negative situation that many families enter after shelter. So if they've been in a shelter, they can't stay there any longer, then they'll end up in this type of arrangement. However, despite the risks associated with it, doubled up homelessness is not incorporated into official estimates of total homelessness, potentially obscuring our understanding of, not potentially, definitely obscuring the understandings of the nature and extent of the problem, and then also misinforming policies to address it. Because we have a whole slew of people, potentially millions of people, who are experiencing this that we just don't know about. And so one thing that Baker was right about in 1996, she was actually right about most of the things, but she was right about, so remember I explained to you, I think, that she theorized that Latinx used their personal networks to gain access to multi-generational housing. She thought this was to avoid streets and shelters, which it is, and she identified this as doubling up in low-cost housing. But whether she defined that as homelessness, I think is a different story. I'm not sure that she did. And so in 2001, there was another study done by Tan and Ray that questioned whether housing precarious or homeless individuals may be doubling up at higher rates than non-Latinx individuals. However, this year, one of my collaborators, Molly Richard, used a new method to try to estimate the number of people who are actually doubled up in the United States. And that figure was 3.7 million people is the estimate of folks who are doubling up. The majority of which, and all of these things are, there's differences, significant differences, depending on your geography, your race, marital status, educational attainment, all of these things. But the highest rate of folks that were found to be doubling up are Latinx folks. Yeah? This is pre-pandemic. This was in 2019. So it's probably worse now. Yeah, and we'll talk about it a little bit later. But also rates of literal homelessness for this community are also increasing. So the fact that they're getting captured in our actual methodologies that don't usually capture them means it's probably a lot more. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
For context, what would be the equivalent measure that you would find, like in official statistics, of homelessness, not including this kind of new measure that you're covering?
For Latinx folks? Or for just in general?
Equivalent to the 3.7 million,
Mm-hmm.
that was all races, or was that only?
That was all races, yeah. Everybody who's doubled up in the U.S.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And so do you know like how many
There
people
is-
are typically homeless in the U.S. in like official statistics?
Yeah, it's, I think, 700,000 folks or something like that. Yeah, so it's, mhm. Oh yeah, it's really, really big, yeah.
I was just not sure like how to think about
Yeah, no, it's a lot more. So the problem we see on the street, it looks bad, especially in places when you go to like LA, but it's really, our housing issue is really a lot bigger. And a lot of it is really behind closed doors. Yeah. Yeah?
Do you have a sense of how crowded Latinx like doubled up housing is versus like other races? Like basically yeah, like you some of these articles were saying like 20 people in a house.
Mhm.
Is that like do you see a bit like sort of like a variance there? Like it's more because you're saying they're using their like personal
Yeah.
network.
So I've focused mostly on Latinx folks, and so that's where most of my knowledge is, but it does happen in other immigrant communities. And so depending on, so homelessness, there's the myth of homelessness, right, is that a lot of folks will move to California to be homeless in California, for example, or move to a place that has better weather because Wisconsin is a really shitty place to be homeless in the winter, right? Like these, but the reality is that most folks that are unhoused somewhere have community there or have lived there previously, and so homelessness in a community mirrors what the community usually looks like. So if you have a large African immigrant community in your community, those folks are probably going to be experiencing this at higher levels. So in LA, because Latinos are such a big part of that community, there's a lot of Latinx homelessness. In a place that has mostly white folks in Appalachia, you'll have a lot of white folks who will be experiencing these things. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So let's see, where are we? There you go. And so now let's talk a little bit about the rates of literal homelessness. And these are the folks that are on the street, right? These are the folks that we typically think of when we think of unhoused people. So going back to Baker in 1996, in regard to that paradox that she identified in homelessness, she briefly considered that perhaps an issue might be that a methodological bias exists. Namely, that Latinos are systematically undercounted or undersampled in surveys of unhoused people, and that therefore certain regions of the United States, like the Southwest, include hidden communities of Latinx homelessness. And this would go probably for all communities, right? So including in the Midwest. But then she discounted that and said, you know, even if that is happening, it's probably a really small number of people, and it wouldn't account for like the big disparity that we're seeing. And the Latinx paradox is probably a better explanation of what is going on. So this, in addition to other issues that are specific to this community, includes things, and another reason why people would be missed, not just the methodological issues, are that folks have language barriers, so they don't know where to actually go look for services, and there's no outreach being done in Spanish or whatever other language people are speaking. For farm workers, they're migratory labor patterns, so you're not in a community long enough to know what services are available, or if you are able to get on some kind of waiting list, you're gone by the time that would become available for you. And patterns that, so these are all patterns that hide housing precarity in plain sight for a lot of us. For farm workers, a lot of folks end up sleeping in their cars. There's also folks who, if they are farm workers whose family is still in whatever originating country, they make the decision to forego housing because they're sending as much money as possible home, and housing is a really expensive thing. And if you're spending all of your money doing that, then why did you even come here to make your life better? And so they'll end up, if they're able, the best situation in their perspective sometimes is ending up in one of these really overcrowded housing units, because you pay really small amount in rent because everybody is dividing the rent, and you're still able to send money home. In a significant amount. And so when we're talking about these rates of literal homelessness, most minority groups or minoritized groups in the United States are experiencing homelessness at higher rates than their white counterparts. And so therefore they make up a disproportionate share of the unhoused population. African Americans, for example, make up 13% of the general population, but they make up 40% of the homeless population. Similarly, American Indian, Alaska Natives, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders, and people who identify as two or more races make up a disproportionate share of the homeless population. But according to these official figures, Latinx folks, unlike other minoritized groups, only, and of course I use the word only in quotes because nobody should be unhoused, make up a share of the homeless population that is approximately equal to their share of the general population, while whites and Asians are significantly underrepresented. The issue here is that, similar to what we've been discussing with doubled up homelessness, locally and nationally, official homeless count numbers estimate the number of individuals and families experiencing both sheltered and unsheltered homeless through the use of the point in time count, which Latinx folks are not engaging with. So in order to be part of that sheltered number, you have to have had gone to a shelter and entered into the HMIS system through getting screened and doing all of that. Or you were unhoused during one night in January when folks were out counting everyone who was out on the street. And so, for example, I've met folks, 2 women in particular who are sisters, who have family who are farm workers, but what they do is clean houses and take care of children. And so what they do is they'll crash at people's houses during the week. And so they'll go on Tuesday to one of their brother's houses, and then on Wednesday to another of their siblings' houses. And then when they feel they've kind of overstayed their welcome, they'll go somewhere else. And sometimes they'll stay in the car if they feel they've overstayed their welcome at both of these places. And so they wouldn't necessarily be counted in any of these because maybe that day in January they were at their brother's house or at their cousin's. And so that's how these folks are getting missed in those. And so in addition, many of the counts take place through shelters we already talked about. Families experiencing both sheltered and unsheltered homelessness aren't captured in these, and most of the folks don't go to shelters because there's a big stigma in the community about being homeless. So for example, those 2 sisters that I mentioned, they would never call themselves homeless. They see themselves and they'll say things like we're in transition, or they know their situation is precarious, but they wouldn't assign homeless as one of the things that they identify with. Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering if you have any awareness of like when official statistics get taken, like for instance when the census mails out ACS forms or the census, forms in the census years, how people respond if they're in one of these overcrowded homes, or if they're like in a sort of transitionary sort of period.
Yeah, so there's the literature on like mixed status households says that most folks, and this is what I've seen as well out in the field, most folks default to like their most vulnerable family member. So if you have a family member who is undocumented, which a lot of folks who are in these arrangements are mixed status. So you'll have someone who's a citizen who potentially lives with their sibling who's undocumented and a cousin who has a green card. They will try to stay under the radar to protect that one sibling who is undocumented. And so they may not mail that back, and they don't want anybody coming to see what's going on. Mm-hmm.
So further underreporting.
Yes.
Sort of by sort of these other factors that
Yep.
People maybe don't have. There's this sort of perception of, am I homeless? Well, no, I'm in transition, like you're saying.
Or I have somewhere to stay, like I sleep indoors.
So it's like that's like a different thing than if somebody considered themselves to be homeless or not homeless and living in a place with lots of other people, they maybe would still underreport because of other.
Yeah, because of it, yeah. Which affects the way that we allocate resources for these things, right? And so not only in terms of like the census with getting representation, but then also how much money we allocate for different things.
I guess a follow-up question.
Yeah.
It's like for children, or like when children are of school age,
Mm-hmm.
if there's like standard practice for like establishing residence if
Mm-hmm.
you lived in one of these overcrowded homes, like do people
That's the one place. So Molly's work, which I talked about, she did the estimate of how many people might actually be doubling up. Part of that data came from the McKinney-Vento Act, which is an education policy that counts children who are living in precarious situations as actually being homeless. So that data is part of what fills in what's missing in the census data. Mm-hmm. So the children who are living in these types of arrangements are actually considered unhoused by their school districts, and they're eligible for programs and other things at the school. Mm-hmm. And so you started a conversation about the definitions of homelessness, right? And so that's exactly where we're going next. So this is the HUD definition of literal homelessness. So literal homelessness incorporates these three things. So they're individuals or families who lack fixed, regular, and adequate nighttime residence. So this means that they have a primary nighttime residence that is a public or private place not meant for human habitation. Or they're living in a publicly or privately operated shelter designed to provide temporary living arrangements, including congregate shelters, transitional housing, and hotels paid for by charitable organizations or by federal, state, and local government programs. Or they are exiting an institution where she or he has resided for 90 days or less and who resided in an emergency shelter or place not meant for human habitation immediately before entering that institution. And these institutions can be things like jail, hospital, rehab, those types of things. And so the reason that this is important to talk about is because it also affects how we decide who's going to get what services, right? And this is the HUD definition, but there's also definitions for the VA. They also deal with some programs for unhoused folks. There's also definitions used by Health and Human Services, Social Security Administration. And so that really creates a situation where, you know, if I'm one of those folks living in that apartment with 40 people, if I go and try to seek services, am I going to qualify for them? Will you know, these things hold true? According to this, they wouldn't necessarily be eligible for any of these services. And so I'll talk a little bit later about some of the projects that I'm working on, but some of them have to do with precisely this and how people are deciding who's getting what services. So here, we've been having this conversation, but why are these definitions important? So if Latinx individuals and families are more likely to be hidden, then current approaches could exacerbate disparities in housing and health through resource allocation that fails to identify their needs. Insufficient distribution of resources across regions can result in those experiencing homelessness being unable to find services or service providers capable of meeting their needs, or even failing to receive services due to the challenges of leaving their current communities to seek assistance. Unequal distribution of resources can also lead to a concentration of need in some communities compared to others. In a lot of places, some of our rural agricultural communities are precisely experiencing this. And so given that how we measure homelessness has a critical impact on the way that resources are allocated, access to housing resources for individuals experiencing homelessness are impacted by how the program defines homelessness and documentation needed to apply for these resources. And so documents needed can include proof of experience and length of homelessness. And so if you're living in this place with 40 other people, you don't necessarily have that. As well as legal status in the United States, which, as we know, with our farm working community can be an issue. And then current definitions of homelessness impact who qualifies for resources and to identify the housing resources, if any, are available for individuals that are foreign born, including non-resident individuals. Some places do have resources that could be used by these folks, but a lot of times folks are scared to even go ask because of some of the things that we've already mentioned. If you're living with folks who are undocumented, you're less likely to go want to engage anybody who may be, in some way connected to the government. And so these definitions are impacting who can get what, and it impacts who gets outreach, even if we know that these folks are existing, for example. And like I already mentioned, a lot of these, so someone who's living in this apartment with 40 other people, if they show up and they say, oh, well, one of the first things they'll get asked is like, well, are you indoors or are you outdoors? And they're technically indoors. And so in a lot of instances, the street level bureaucrats who are making the decisions of whether they're going to provide services or not, they're also making value judgments of like, well, they're indoors and the next person is outside, and so we're going to give resources to the person who's actually sleeping on the sidewalk rather than the person who is in in an apartment because they'll see that they make the judgment that the need is greater in other situation. And if they're looking at the definition of literal homelessness and that's who is eligible, then they're not necessarily wrong in doing that, right? And so this is why these conversations are important. And so farm worker homelessness. This is something that I've been looking more into as I've come into the Midwest. And so we've recently, I think, as a community of academics and also just in general journalists, other folks, are recognizing that there is a surge in Latinx homelessness. However, there's still misunderstandings about what this looks like. And when it comes to specific groups within the broader Latinx community, it can get even more complicated. So farm workers, for example, they come up they've come up, I think, throughout the talk already in a few of the examples. But some of they're especially vulnerable to the situations a lot of the times, depending on their status, their documentation status, whether they're accessing their housing through their employer, which is still a fairly common practice. So I think I mentioned when I was introducing myself, I grew up in a migrant camp in California. So farm workers traditionally have accessed, seasonal farm workers, their housing through the farmers that they're working for. So the farmers will set up a camp, or they'll have 5, 6, 7 homes that they fix up, and the farm workers will live there. Some provide family housing, some do not. A lot of them will be like men camps. So right next door to the camp that I grew up in was a men's camp where it was just men, usually because they were the ones who traveled by themselves and they left their families either in their home state if they were from here, or in their home country if they were coming from somewhere else, and sending the money to those folks. But there's a whole slew of really problematic things that happen when your employer is providing your housing, when they're also your landlord. And so a lot of folks will live, for example, one of the things that I've seen, with a broken toilet for like 2-3 months at a time because they don't want to call their boss and say, hey, the toilet is broken. Especially in the Midwest, we're currently, nationwide, we have an aging farm worker population. And so our immigration is down in general, and so we're not replacing our older farm workers. And in our traditional farm workers are actually folks who are mostly U.S. citizen and residents. They're 53% of them are either citizens or have green cards. And so because of those things, and some folks who have gained status or are documented their citizens move out of farm work, they come in and out of farm work. And so we're filling in gaps with H-2A programs, which are guest worker programs, and that happens a lot in Wisconsin, in Michigan, in Illinois, and throughout the Midwest. And so, and then we have undocumented folks. So we have like 3 different types of farm workers who are all dealing with these issues at different levels. And so there is protection in some of these, right? So if you're one of those farm workers that's a traditional farm worker that comes from South Texas, from the colonias of South Texas into Wisconsin or into Michigan, and you've been doing that for 2 or 3 generations, and you have status, you're more protected than our H-2A folks. And then because they do have the H-2A status, which is a status because you're here legally, you're more protected than our undocumented folks who have no protection at all. And some of, in Michigan, where I've been doing the work, they actually have programs where the formal camps, because you also have informal labor camps, the formal camps are regulated by the state, and you have to get licensed. And so those are usually better than the informal camps or stuff that folks find on the private market. But even those, the state doesn't really have a lot of enforcement power. They have the ability to fine the farmer one time, and then that's it. And then nothing really happens. And then the folks who work in dairy farms who also have a lot of these same issues aren't actually classified as farm workers, and so they don't, they're not regulated under those labor camps don't have to get licensed at all. And so there's no one checking. Yeah?
Is that just in Michigan, or is that?
That's in Michigan. I'm not sure about the Wisconsin context, but I wouldn't be surprised if it was the same. And so up to very recently, there was really no political will to incorporate those folks into the that system. The farm worker licensing program actually came through when the UFW was getting formed and through the Chicano movement back in the like 60s and 70s. And so since then, there hasn't really been another like push to do that. In Michigan, there's maybe some hope because the state legislature is now, for the first time in 40 years, led by Democrats. And so maybe that with a Democratic governor might create some political will there, but farmers are still very powerful in Michigan, as they are throughout the Midwest, and so it could go either way with that. But these folks are living in, there's some folks that are living in official licensed migrant camps, labor camps, but there's some informal ones, so the folks that don't have to get that licensing are living in these types of arrangements. Some of them, where the farmers aren't providing the housing, will go into the private market and will live either in RVs or mobile home parks. They'll live in old motels, in their vehicles. They'll live in campgrounds, in the actual field under a tarp sometimes, in barns, in tool sheds. And then I wrote colonias there. This happens mostly on the US-Mexico border, but one of my colleagues at MSU, Dr. Noah Durst, is doing some work on communities that look exactly like colonias but exist outside that 150-mile designation that the Cranston-Gonzalez Act uses to designate what a colonia is. And so there's lots of them throughout the United States. And that's a picture of farm workers who are living right near a field that they're working in.
So forgive my ignorance on this, but so you're saying that there are labor camps that the either state or federal government is aware of, possibly horrible living conditions?
Yeah.
They are not concerned about addressing those?
Yes. Yes. That's, yeah. Yeah. And it's not. Yeah. They're fairly common. It's a very common practice. It's been going on since the 1950s. I grew up in one. The one I grew up in was very nice, was very well taken care of. But there's varying degrees. The one that I mentioned, the men's camp that was right next door to us. So like it was, first of all, I say it's very nice, but I also grew up right across the street from a wastewater treatment plant, like literally 50 feet away. That shouldn't have happened, but that's where they put the camp. The camp next door to us was the men's camp, and that was really dilapidated. They sometimes didn't have running water, and separating the two camps was like a pen where they kept cattle. And so it smelled horrible. And so I have fond memories of growing up there, but thinking back, maybe I should have been somewhere else. But yes, this is a fairly common practice. There's lots of them in Wisconsin. So, the Midwest. So here, So as I mentioned already, this post-pandemic moment, there has been some recognition that Latinx homelessness is on the rise. However, this is mostly due to the fact that literal and street homelessness in the community is growing even more than we can see, which means that, like I mentioned, the fact that we can actually see it means that it's probably a worse problem than what we're thinking it is. And so many Midwest cities have seen an increase in this post-pandemic moment of Latinx individuals experiencing homelessness. Chicago saw a significant increase in the number of Latinx people experiencing homelessness in their 2021 point in time count. So it went from 12,813 in 2019 to from 18 to 18 to 72. So like 6,000 more people were in that count just in that 1 year alone. And in 2021, a lot of communities didn't actually do a point-in-time count, so we really don't know how many unhoused people we have right now. And most folks skip 2021, and they're barely getting to it now in 2022. And so in Wisconsin, Latinx folks are 2.2 times as likely to experience homelessness compared to white Wisconsinites, which I found is how you call someone from Wisconsin when I Googled it. As a Michigander, I should know these things. So Wisconsin's population is 83% white. So as I mentioned earlier, what that means is that most of your unhoused folks are white folks, because your unhoused population looks like what your community looks like. But the fact that Latinx folks are 2.2 times more likely to experience homelessness here means that you probably have a way bigger problem than you think that you do in that community. And I wouldn't be surprised if your doubled-up homelessness numbers are also very high, especially in your rural farming communities. So I've talked a little bit about my projects already as we've been having this conversation. But these are some of the things that I'm currently working on. So my first project that I have listed there, the Housing Precarity and Farmworking Communities in Western Michigan, is being funded by IRP, so thank you very much. And so what I've been doing there, I've actually been working, so I do ethnography, and I like to do relational ethnography, which means that I like to look at both sides of an issue. Usually folks, when they're doing ethnography, they'll focus on working with the unhoused folks, for example, and that's where they stay. I like to look at the experience of unhoused folks, but then also the experience of the street level bureaucrats that are delivering services to these folks, and then how that relationship works. And that's where the relational part comes in. And so currently I have been doing ride-alongs with the folks that license the migrant camps in Michigan. And so kind of going with them to do inspections and doing those kinds of things. Was there a question? Oh, sorry. Yeah, and so I've also worked with them on a survey that they will be delivering to folks that are living in some of these licensed camps about how they go about reporting when something happens, whether there's ever a time that they hesitate to report it at all, and what those things, how they're working. And we'll also be doing interviews with folks who are living in these arrangements. And I also have a project that is funded by LPPI at UCLA, the Latino Policy and Politics Institute. And we're really looking at those definitions of homelessness and kind of that thing that we've been kind of having a conversation about already, of how street level bureaucrats who are delivering these services are making decisions about who is eligible and who isn't, especially when they're working. We're working with VA funding, so I'm using the VA definition, or we're working with Social Security Administration, so we're using that definition, or are they also imposing some of their own moral judgments on these things and delivering services regardless of what the definition is, and those types of things. So I'm working on that with both Drs. Molly Richard and Melissa Chinchilla, and Molly is leading the quantitative part of it, where we're estimating how many folks are actually doubled up in LA, and then I'm leading the qualitative part, where I'm talking to the service providers to see how they're making those decisions. And for future research, I really would like to, in terms of the definition, really like to focus on how folks are defining themselves to be. So not just the definitions for how we make these policy decisions, because I really struggle with the idea that I may be imposing the title of homeless or unhoused on a community that really finds that really stigmatizing. But at the same time, knowing that if we don't, there's resources that we won't be able to provide to the community. And so how are folks seeing their situation? I mentioned, I've had some insight into this as I've collected data. So people see themselves as being in transition, or they know that they're not typically housed, but none of them would really, I think, assign the title of homeless to themselves. And so how do we, as researchers, navigate those types of things? And so I really would like to do some work on that particular part of this whole thing. So, yep, and so what are the implications? And we've been having the conversation. The implications of this is that folks aren't getting the resources that they need, right? So when we're not measuring accurately, and those are the measurements that we're using to allocate resources, then we're not getting resources to the community. And so because we haven't been accurately accounting for either literal homeless, unhoused Latinx folks or those who are doubled up, then we haven't really been doing anything to help that community. And especially when you wrap that all up in, you know, these narratives that we have about, oh, well, they're really resilient and, you know, they aren't as marginalized as they should be. They're doing really well for how then it really creates a big problem. And so that's where I'd really want to make sure that we use this work to allocate more resources, make more resources available, and then also accessible, because having them be available doesn't mean that they're necessarily accessible. And so that's really where I would like to take my work. Thank you. Are there any questions? Yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing your presentation. This is wonderful. I'm so glad to see the best of the work that you're doing. A quick question about the ongoing project, or the new project with the Michigan street-level bureaucrats.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk a little bit about that relationship? Like, first, was it local, county, state, and how receptive are they to the engagement of the work in terms of you coming in as an outsider?
Yeah.
To sort of analyze their method.
Yeah, so that's been actually really interesting. It's been a little bit slow because building rapport with folks when you're not from somewhere is slow. But so because I grew up in a farm working community, even though the United States is a very, very large place, it's also a very small place in certain communities, and the migrant trails cross a lot of times. And I grew up with folks who usually did the Michigan, Texas migrant route. But sometimes when the season's not very good in Michigan, you'll end up in California. Or when, or if it's not really good in Michigan or California, you'll go to Colorado or Washington. And so growing up in the migrant camp, I knew folks who did mostly Texas, Michigan. And so when I got to Michigan, they're still living there, and was able to connect with some of the farm working communities there through them, and then got connected to so Michigan has migrant councils. So the state is divided into different councils. So like, for example, Lansing is in the capital area migrant council, and then there's like the Western Michigan migrant council and the Eastern. And so I've been attending those meetings. They've been on Zoom, so I've been able to go to the ones for all of the state and have kind of gotten connected to folks that way. And so the person who runs the licensing program I met through being in these meetings, and they've been very receptive. They're also doing their work on like a shoestring budget, and so any help that they can get, they will take. And so because I'm a researcher and they're like, we need to do a survey, and I'm like, I know how to do that, they'll be like, help me. And so the partnership has worked well. The political will part of it is the harder part. I think that all the folks who are in the migrant councils, and they really care about this work and they want to do a lot of stuff, but then there's certain times where they just get to a wall and they can't do very much after that. But they've been really receptive to my work. I was going to mention something else that I thought was important. It'll come back to me, but yeah, that's how I kind of become connected. And so it's been a whole year of attending all of these meetings, and barely, like, that's when the ball starts rolling. That's how ethnographic research works. Yeah.
Just a clarification question. So workers on dairy farm aren't considered farm workers?
No, they're not. They fall under agricultural workers, which are different than farm workers. That's how definitions in public policy work. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So can you talk a little bit more about the doubled up homelessness and what role landlords play? So are they like charging extra because there's so many people like, is it actually cheaper, or are they being?
So it depends on the landlord. Like, there's definite slumlords who know that there are 40 people in their unit, but turn a blind eye and collect the rent and just don't fix anything. May even know that some of them are undocumented, so they know they don't have to necessarily fix anything because people will get scared. There's other landlords that I'm sure don't necessarily know. And so there'll be just one person who signs the lease, and then everybody gives them the rent, and then they pay the rent to the landlord. Yeah.
So I'm curious to hear your thoughts. Some people here at IRP study housing assistance, right? So that's a set of HUD programs.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm trying to, so when you're talking about not getting the resources that the communities need, I'm wondering if you see a mismatch between the ways in which we try and provide housing assistance to those that are low income, even if they're not homeless, but maybe housing precarious,
Mm-hmm.
versus what you would see is needed in these communities, or is it really just more of the existing programs being directed towards these communities?
Well, I think it's that, but then also some of those programs don't go to undocumented folks, and that's a need that needs to happen. And so there is a mismatch in that particular way. But more outreach to Spanish speakers, more outreach to, like, more education on what is available to folks would be also very helpful. Yeah. Yeah.
So I don't want to be greedy, but I have two questions.
Uh-huh.
Do you have any sort of sense of, like, with this group of people that you've identified, how much can be attributed to people working, like, on these very large farms or for very large employers versus people who may just that they just happen to be in a life situation where this is what they need to do, and they're not like a camp or a large group setting. Do you have any sort of?
So this is happening with folks who work for really large farm employers, and also the folks that work for small farms. So there's one particular, for example, a small farm that only has 3 houses, and that's enough for all of the farm workers that they have, but it's a very dilapidated 3 houses. And then there's the big farmers who will have like a entire camp that could be dilapidated. There's also folks who have large farms who have really great housing for their farm workers and actually do everything that the licensing board wants them to do. There's also some farmers actually license hotel rooms. So they'll, rent out a whole hotel for the season, and that's where they'll put their farm workers. And those also range. Some are very nice and some are not. It's very variable from farmer to farmer. Yeah.
That's related to that. So if there's a lot of variation in the quality of housing, I would think that people would prefer the jobs in which the housing is better. Is there some, like, we don't give you crappy housing, but we pay you better? Like, how do the places with the really low quality housing
Recruit?
Yeah, how can they get people?
Yeah, people are really desperate for jobs.
Okay.
And so that's just how people end up taking the opportunity that they can, especially the 2 groups that probably fall most under that are the folks who are undocumented and also the folks who are the H-2A visa folks. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And like this is just because I've studied other issues specific to Michigan and how they do licensing for
Mhm.
precarious workers. One of the things that, as you were talking about this, brought this up for me is thinking about this like problem that does come with policy when we move like a particularly vulnerable group that is in some way legal and then create some form of legal status where oftentimes there's still this like it makes them legal, it maybe gives them some form of protection, but it often is just designed to criminalize them in some other way.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just wondering what your sense of like, it sounds like the person you're working with has like great intentions, but that often is a problem still with policy. Do you have a sense that that's happening in this situation or could happen or is happening in other areas?
Well, I think it definitely happens with the H-2A folks. We kind of want to have our cake and eat it too. We want to have workers for the aging farm worker population that we have, but we don't want to let people in. And so we want them to come pick our crops and then go back home. And so that's an immigration system issue that is definitely a problem. And folks, so if they do come with the H-2A program and they end up in one of the farms that has the really crappy housing, they don't want to complain because they want to come back next season. And if you're tagged as like a troublemaker, the farmer won't want you back. And then they tell other farmers, oh, don't, Deya's going to just complain, don't even, And so they're afraid that that'll happen. There's a question in the back. Yeah.
I think as we see demographics shifting throughout the whole country, in particular in Wisconsin, as we see larger amounts of communities changing from to minority majority populations. I grew up in northern Wisconsin, and there's a decent amount of towns now that pop through it. There's a decent amount of Mexican restaurants through there and whatnot. And so as we see an increase in or change in demographics, I guess it's easy to focus on some of the very negative things of that, but we also see a lot of successes, or some successes as well, as far as housing for farmer workers and migrant workers and dairy. And for instance, in Darlington, about 30 minutes away from here, we have a successful 24 housing units designated for dairy farmers, and that was paid through LIHTC dollars and other USDA dollars and whatnot. So I guess my question being, what have you seen as far as communities coming together, and what types of things have we seen as far as housing successes in the Midwest or in farming?
Yeah, so I'm not sure that I have an example in the Midwest, but I am working on a case study in California, where in the community of Woodland, California, they built because some of there's also migrant camps that are run by the state and by local government. So like the county will run one, and so they built an affordable housing units that were specifically for farm workers. So to qualify for it, you had to be a farm worker or have family members who are farm workers that live with you. And it was the very first zero net energy residential housing, multi-family housing in the entire country. And so this thing has gotten like national awards and international awards for their design. And the reason they decided to go with that design was that they actually did a survey of the farm workers before building it, and the farm workers were like, well, rent isn't the only problem we're affording. We can't afford our utilities either. And so part of the strategy was, well, if we have solar energy, then that'll cut down on costs for utilities as well. And that has actually been very well received in the community. Like there was virtually like zero NIMBY activism against this thing. And when you have affordable housing and there's no NIMBY backlash, that's a really big deal, especially when it's for farm workers or another type of marginalized community. And it's in like a middle class neighborhood. Like there's houses for sale there, and this isn't saying much in California, but there's like houses for sale for $3 million around the development, which is for California not super expensive, but still it's not, in a like super low income neighborhood. And so there's examples of places where people are kind of getting the gist that like we need food, especially during and after COVID. Like there are essential workers who were still picking our food that we needed. And so I think that maybe some of those things played into that, and having it also be a net zero development, maybe folks were more into that than it just being like another affordable housing development. And so there are examples of places that have done projects like that. Yeah? Mm-hmm. Yeah, so what I was talking about there is these narratives that we like imagine that Latinos, because of how we framed it, they all live in multi-generational housing. But if you look at the actual official numbers, they're very on par with Black communities and with Asian communities. But we do have a problem of severe overcrowding, which is different than multi-generational housing, is what I'm saying. Maybe, but there's also no research that I know of people looking at severe overcrowding in Black communities. It may be happening, I'm not sure. Or in Asian communities, it might be happening. There is more instances of multi-generational housing in foreign-born communities, and so there may be extreme overcrowding happening in like immigrant Asian communities, for example. I would not be surprised if that was the case. Yeah.
First of all, I think it's tremendous work that you're doing, and I had no idea about the definitions of homelessness and how that obscures this whole issue. I'm wondering, like, you know, because you got into all the nuances of reasons for why somebody might not want to identify as homeless. You've also got to know about the problems of employer-provided housing. And this is sort of like half formed in my head, so forgive me, but I'm just curious if like you see any potential for these large farms. Like, I don't want to paint all farms as being, you know, these
horrible.
farms, but
Yeah.
like, but for the very large farms, do you see potential for them not necessarily providing the housing directly, but maybe the funding that the local governments could then use to provide the housing?
Yeah.
I don't know,
Like
some sort of
workforce
tax
housing
or
that's
things
done
like
by
that.
the city or the county or the state, and the farmers like
Yeah.
pay for it. Yeah, absolutely. That could be something that we could do.
I will just tag on. Give us some solutions. Like, what
Yes.
is it that we should be thinking about in terms of solutions?
Yeah, so that's definitely something we could do. And if you look at the quality of the migrant camps, the ones that are provided by the farmers versus the ones that are provided by the local jurisdictions, you see the quality very different. And so potentially, and we do that with affordable housing developments in other, so we'll ask the developers to provide a certain number that are affordable for a certain group of folks. We could be doing something like that with farmers as well. Yeah?
Another question off of kind of this idea of like what are solutions. Do you have a sense if policymakers like care? Because like, I mean, to them it might be, well, they're not on the, like I think part of this like cultural idea that you've been talking about, this perpetuation of the narrative that like, oh, well, they like to live that way. They like this multi-generational home for people.
Yeah.
I mean, for them it's maybe like a little bit out of sight, out of mind. So
It's convenient.
Yeah.
We don't have to do anything if we don't know about it, right? Yes. So I don't know that I have a sense of like what particular policymakers are, what their intentions are. But there's definitely misunderstandings about it, and maybe not necessarily the total like, oh, I need to go learn more about this, right? Like, things are working, and farmers have a lot of power in a lot of these communities. And so, and not just now, like historically, and they may also be like the commissioners or the like whatever it is in those places, and so that also has an effect. There's also just misunderstandings about the community that we need to get over. So like one of the things when you said, something you said reminded me, I was in one of the meetings, the migrant council meetings, and these are all people who are like on the farm worker side, right? They like want to help. But they kept making these comments. They were saying like, oh, they were talking about heat exposure, which is not something that you've necessarily had to worry too much about in the Midwest for a long time. But now with climate change, it's something that is real, and in the summer it gets really hot. And so you have to worry about heat exposure. And my people are from Arizona. We've been dealing with heat exposure for a really long time. And so we're they were talking and they kept saying like, oh, well, they're outside in the field and they want to wear their hoodies, they're acclimated. And I'm thinking to myself, like, we're not a different species of people. Like, we're not acclimated to anything. It's sun protection. Like, you're covering your body because you don't want this, like, it's hot, but you're protecting yourself from the sun. And so I just made a comment like, it's for sun protection. And they were just like, oh, like, and it's still a lot of misunderstandings about people, that we, just because we haven't maybe been around folks, or that we still are like perpetuating a lot of.
elements of like policy, good intention, white saviorism.
Right. Yes. Yeah.
So are the H-2A visas employer sponsored?
Yes.
So that's what you're talking about not being labeled like a troublemaker? Like,
Mhm.
it seems like if that was removed from, you have to keep a good reputation and not make trouble, if those visas were not employer sponsored, that seems
Yeah.
like it would also be.
Yeah, our immigration system is certainly broken, and that plays into this a lot. Mm-hmm.
And it also seems like, especially I was thinking, you were talking about people actually living under a tarp in the field
Oh, yeah.
or along the fields. Like, there are very few percentage-wise farms that are organic. So
Oh,
I'm
yeah,
guessing
they're
that
sleeping
having
in.
huge exposure to pesticides
Yes.
and
Mhm.
herbicides. So.
Yeah. Yeah.
One last question.
Oh, okay. I was just saying, is there like a particular reason why there's not like a more private market housing? Or when I mentioned like northern Wisconsin, I don't imagine housing is very expensive there. Like developers could probably just build some housing for them. And even in California, I'm sure it's a different case because private housing is just extremely expensive.
We're having housing is in crisis everywhere. Like even in Wisconsin, which what might appear for us as middle class folks for the most part to be affordable is not really affordable for folks who are getting farm worker wages. And so there's not a big market for developers who really want to do developments for those folks who can't usually pay very much.
Thank you, Jay, for a great talk.
Thank you. Thank you so much.